A Cat That Really Was Gone. A story by Big Grug. Chapter 1. A lone shadow crossed the large tiles of the floor, illuminated by moonlight. The stars reflected from the glassy surface of the interior, revealing the craftsmanship inside. Expansive decorations and lovely glass textures entwined with the placements of a few benches or potted plants. Artistry and carvings lined the long walkways of the halls, no expense spared for the grandest building in Russia. The Kremlin was the mighty capital, standing for decades as a sign of Russia's defiance to anyone who would oppose them. The colorful domes of bright colors stood atop pillars of masterful architecture. Near these ornaments is a large rectangular building covered in windows and arcs, where the fortified compound sat behind the walls of the capital. Gold accents, white bricks, and green highlights danced along the strong fortifications, a bold color scheme that flourished until it was met with a foreign hue. Enormous purple banners swayed only just in the crisp night air. The massive unfurled flags draped across the many windows of the Kremlin spotted a slash and two dots, accompanied by many more hung from the turrets and once proud Russian stars. The figure that walked through the halls listened to her own echoing footsteps. Her pace was steady, with classic sound of stiletto hitting tile resounding through the empty passageways. She peeked just for a second, out of the glass pan leaking silver beams. It only served to worsen her mood. Aliens, purple Amazons, had conquered the heart of the country. It had been years since the occupying force of the Shavanti had successfully invaded Earth. Governments fell fast. The Kremlin itself was their first target in Russia. The halls were once filled with bursting attendants and government workers, but the Shavanti had mostly eliminated the need for them. They promised that nothing had changed and that they were simply there to supervise, but she knew the truth. The government was a puppet now, nothing more. The alien did most of the work. They just needed to shut up, sit down, and look pretty. She grimaced at that. Every now and then some countess or whatever the hell they were would come and ask questions, or simply need something done with human resources. Usually this would entail investigating rebels or divulging information to the Shavanti interior. She never really knew what happened after that. She was mostly kept in the dark, just like always. Finally she stopped. She turned and faced the maple door, glass so she could see her reflection quite clearly. Deep wrinkles creased, and her sullen eyes that had lost their youth stared back. She pushed away a few grey strands of hair that dangled across her antique glasses that strapped around her head with a string. She straightened her back and coat, cleared her throat, and adjusted her glasses one last time, and bravely opened the door with a clipboard in hand. Inside, she found the one that had requested her presence at such a late hour. A shill, a high-ranking one at that, if the markings were anything to go by. The tall purple woman had an imposing silhouette, with moonlight flanking her broad shoulders and tied-up hair. Hands uncrossed, her face sullen and serious. The imposing woman gestured to the chair in front of the desk she sat in. "Dr. Christina, please sit. We have much to discuss." "The alarm. Emergency. Something is wrong. Alarm is active." Blood pumped harder and faster into the augmented brain. "Alarm detected. Intruder?" "Unlikely. Stop alarm. Assess situation." Dust that covered every crevice began to rustle and blew ever so slightly from the disturbance in the void. A tinge of blue began to pervade through the dark, slowly revealing the abyss to be a tiled room. The aura grew more, reaching a peak that filled the area with a ghostly aura. Eyelids covered in frost and ice began to shake. Slowly and steadily they opened to their surroundings. Mist danced through the dark surroundings that became clear as sense began to awaken in the body. The first thing the nerves felt was cold, blistering cold. The type of cold that would freeze a person in seconds, as was intended. Assuming last recollection true, acting accordingly to standard procedure. With this, the figures strained their muscles to break free from the chilled container. Decades of stasis had rendered them confused and unresponsive. Trying once more to budge, the ice held steadfast. It could wait for the flesh to once again cooperate. The cold was a nuisance, but nothing it had not faced before. The far north had been crueler. Its hand twitched. Accelerated and controlled blood flow did the trick to get the extremities to cooperate once more with the demands of the brain. Shaking arms bent at the elbow to reach forward, stopping when the fingertips collided with a frosted barrier. It paused. The brain worked overtime, twying off the metal ice lost in slumber. The figure remembered now. Prototype, cryostasis. Deactivation would only occur before the set date of secondary energy source ran dry. If excluding outside variables, the battery lasted for about 30 years or more, maybe less. It did not care at the moment. The cover had not released the subject yet, and it had grown impatient. It needed to function. Primary objective: locate cause of outage. Control center priority. Blood ran faster now to awaken the mass of bone and muscle. Toes and fingers twitched before curling repeatedly. The figure twitched slightly more, eyelids blinked faster, breathing and heart rate exploded. With a final push of newfound effort, the clear covering above the metal casket launched before cracking against some unseen object in the room. Moments passed while abrupt noise abated through the dark, the figure shifting once more. Faint wisps of fog floated from the edges of the object it was entombed within. Deep gasps became controlled, calm. The practiced breathing it should always have, and maintain. Willing itself up, abdominal muscles wailed in protest from their sudden load. Two muscular arms rocketed to the freezing sides of the tube, aiding the struggling core. Sitting there for what had seemed like an eternity, another deep breath accompanied by the swinging motion of the legs. It was with great effort it overcame the curving lip along the sides of the chamber and planted its soles on the tiles below. Inhuman pupils dilated, struggling to adapt to the change of scenery. The mind connected and refreshed with the nervous system. Modified electric pulses flowing to each handcrafted fiber. Legs became less and less shaky as more weight pressed upon them. With a final grunt, the full form was illuminated by the dying cryopod. Veins riddled the form of the large, nude, and very male figure. Muscle packed from experience and repetitive training strained and flexed, finally working again from a long break. He stood and began reactivation of his sore musculature, straightening his arms. He felt the tricep pump and strain with his shoulders. Curling both arms, ballooning the biceps, he stretched downwards, activating his back muscles. He bent back up, leaning back to mobilize his spine. The scar tissue stretched across his abdomen as he clenched his lats and deltoids, which fared no better in terms of marred texture. The light barely did the damage justice. Healed holes scattered his torso, with jagged slashes through his arms and legs. Curious tattoos adorned the more surgical scars, the straight cuts that one had to see up close to notice. A number and a symbol, varying from Cyrillic characters to more direct symbols. A knife here, a corrosive emblem there. His neck held a large rough gash. A tattoo above it logged the damage with more symbols. The clearest part of him was his head, shaven down to a buzz cut that fit his chiseled face. A vertical slice, clean and healed, with an alpha marking bordering the line that traced the incision, was the only noticeable scar amongst the top of his head. If he was clothed, he might even have passed as normal if viewed from the back, disregarding the irregular mass and size, that is. He held his limbs in front to examine if there was any new damage not logged that had appeared. No new tattoos, either. The solid white eyes methodically addressing his physical well-being. Barely visible pupils methodically ensured every detail. Nothing would slip past. He would not make that mistake again. The alarm did not sound off again, as it had when the pod began shutdown. Perhaps it was a warning of the waning power. So far, he had seen no immediate threat that needed to be in prime condition should the situation call for it. With his own checklist completed, he took in his current setting. Exactly as he remembered it, give or take an inch of dust and lack of fixture lighting. The blue light died down to barely noticeable, leaving him alone again in the dark. Not that it affected him at all. His eyes were made to see in extremely low light situations. They could adapt quickly to low and high light situations as they arose. The quickly fading cryolight gave him just enough to see what he remembered as the prototyping room, brief as his visit had been. Computers, once displaying wealth of data, stood silent, a row on each side of the room. A metal door, reminiscent of submarine hatches, stood at the end of the pseudo-hallway formed by the monitors. And so he set off. Shaky steps reminded him of his recovering state, so he slowed down just a tad to get used to the sensation of motion. His feet slapped against the tile. The mind made the connections again, once again adapting to the habits of movement. The steps grew steadier. By the time the wheel for the hatch was in his grasp, his body was back into the steady state it had been machined to be in. Two rough hands grasped and yanked the wheel into motion, years of grimace and neglect standing no chance against the raw force of the action. The door stubbornly resisted the breaking of the seal, its cries bounding into the pitch-black passageways beyond the gate before yielding. No light remained now, just sheer emptiness and absolute silence. He broke it with the pads of his feet impacting upon the now metal floor. Unfortunately, his eyes were like night vision, and night vision is an enchanter of thermal reflection. With no light to begin with, he was effectively blind as a bat. So he did what bats did, and used sound. Each footstep painted a temporary picture as the waves bounced around to and fro. His modified intellect worked harder, generating a mental formation of the area. He knew where he was now in relation to the control center, past his room, left to the corridor between the armory and the bunks. A long and steady streak began down the lonesome military halls. General Bozentia, the older woman nodded in greeting to the Shivanti. Her shaking hands grasped the firm and slick oak chair, sliding into the fabric cushion and crossing her legs to at least try to give off an air of confidence. The sinister figure suddenly broke her facade, her tusks playing wide as she smiled. We've known each other for what, 3 years now? No need to be so damn professional. The general grinned even wider as she made light of her friend. I just need you to clarify some things for me that I mentioned over the phone. She gestured to an old-looking box that looked to be confused on whether it was a flip phone or a smartphone. Gotta say, Lada, you humans may still be throwing rocks at each other, but you definitely have some good ideas. Like the taxi. That's a good one, too. Oh, or the... Bazenia, with all due respect, I too cherish our relationship. However, it is quite late, and if a social goal was the reason I was alerted, I wish to take my leave. Dr. Christina avoided eye contact, fiddling with the pen attached to her clipboard. Her hands couldn't stop shaking, and she clutched the pen and clipboard for dear life. Bozenia crooked her head and squinted towards one of her best friends. This wasn't like her. Though she stood at a mere 5 feet 6 inches, Lada was a woman that gave off the aura of a matriarch. She first met Lada during the integration of the governments, which she admitted was more of a benign takeover. They had been moving her out of her designated office and needed help with the heavier items in the room. What surprised Bosania was how she took it all in stride, cracking jokes that she'd just gotten the window office too. Bosania had been in charge of the invasion force of this continent, which apparently meant she was responsible for handling it afterwards too. So, she tried her best with patrols and peacekeeping. It didn't work well. Potshots came from the buildings, and though the rounds were easily shrugged off, dozens of them started to hurt. You could start to tell who had patrol next from the amount of bruises they had. Shambling machines that barely passed as cars tried to careen into patrols. Several Marines still tensed up when they heard hard bass music or the smell of vodka. Bozenia had been going crazy. She had never had to take care of a populace before. It had been a nightmare, until Leda helped. Bozenia hadn't really asked for help, just insight into the locals and the perspectives they had. Might as well try to appease or relate to them to decrease the amount of bruising pads they were burning through. Lada was supposedly some social expert and scientist for this old KGB organization, so Bozenia figured it was worth a shot. Lara shot up for the chance to get involved again, which Bustani had not expected at all.